welcome to the Murdoch Children's Research Institute. I'm David Thorburn. I run the Mitochondrial Research Group here and also lead the Genetic Disorders theme, which is one of 5 research themes in the Murdoch Children's. If you've never been to this building before, and it's only been open for about a year and a half now, it's a pretty spectacular building. It's $1 billion worth of building, largely from the state government as a public-private partnership. There's actually 3 organisations here. So there's obviously the Royal Children's Hospital, the Murdoch Children's Research Institute is an independent research institute, and then the University of Melbourne Department of Paediatrics is also based in the hospital. So it's a great place for integrating clinical care and research, and that was the thing that really brought me here back in 1990. I came from Sydney and never left, so it's a fun place to work. Today we're hosting this Amdf Patient Information Day. There's going to be a couple of talks, and I think probably without further ado, I don't think there's any other introductory remarks I need to make. I might introduce Professor Dominic Thyagarajan, who's the head of neurology and Professor of Neuroscience at Monash Medical Centre. Dominic has worked on mitochondrial diseases for many years, including training with, I guess, the father of mitochondrial disease in Australia, Ed Byrne, in Melbourne. Also with Billy DeMauro in New York, and Daryl DeVivo, I think, who are really some of the founding figures in understanding mitochondrial diseases internationally. Came back to Australia, was in Adelaide for a number of years, and returned to Melbourne 3 years ago to head the Department of Neurology at Monash Medical Centre. So Dominic is going to talk about mitochondrial disease, a clinical overview, and we can have some urgent questions if you like then. I'm going to talk a little bit about some background on mitochondrial disease and some of the recent advances, and then we'll have more time for sort of joint questions.
David, thank you very much for that. If you don't mind, I won't stand over there. I'll stay here and might even sit down because it's already Saturday. I'm on my feet most of the week. I'm going to talk really about a clinical overview of mitochondrial diseases. And in the talk, I'm going to pretty much ask these kind of questions: what mitochondria are, what they do, something about the genetics of mitochondria, because that's quite important for understanding and explaining to people about how these diseases arise. And then talk a little bit about the diseases themselves, how they affect people. And they're not actually very simple diseases, so there are different types of mitochondrial diseases. So part of my talk addresses common types of mitochondrial disease that we encounter. And then a little bit about how we diagnose them, and something at the end about treatment. It's always hard to know where to start, about whether you start talking about what things are and what they do, but I think thinking about what they do is perhaps a good starting point. And I'll come back to what they are later. What they do is not simple. With respect to mitochondrial diseases, for the people gathered in this room, we're really only talking about a very small fraction of diseases of mitochondria. And that, what we generally understand to mean diseases of the mitochondrial respiratory chain, which is something in mitochondria. And the function of what that does, this mitochondrial respiratory chain, is to make energy. And they make energy by producing a chemical called ATP. And this is kind of like an energy currency that the body uses. Just like an international exchange or a gold currency or a dollar or something like that. So energy can be shuttled backwards and forwards between various tissues and cells of the body. So that's what these do, and each cell, with the exception of very few kinds of cells, make energy in the body. with the production of ATP, and the respiratory chain is what actually does that. And that's what we're talking about when we really talk about mitochondrial diseases in this kind of a sense, is that we're talking about diseases of that respiratory chain. But the mitochondria themselves do many, many things. In fact, quite a lot of biochemistry, enormously complex biochemistry, is contained within mitochondria. So they do all sorts of other things. Some things that I think we don't even really fully understand just yet. But apart from generating energy, they also, quite an important function with respect to mitochondrial diseases is that they make and they take away toxic biochemicals called free radicals. And this is quite important in how these diseases arise. They're very much involved with how cells ultimately die. So there are death pathways for cells. Cells just don't simply die. They undergo a series of biochemical, within cells there are a series of biochemical reactions which ultimately lead to the death of that cell. And mitochondria is central in that. But as I said, there are so many functions. So all of these might have, some of these might have a relevance to how mitochondrial disease arise in people. But for this talk, predominantly going to talk about energy production. But if you look down here, these are just some of the complex biochemistries or biochemical cycles that are inside mitochondria. I don't know if I can, maybe I should turn the light down a little bit if I can, so you can see it. So I've started by saying what they do, and this is what they actually look like. So remember I mentioned the word cell. On the right here, I've just got some cells growing as you might grow seedlings on a cover slip in a dish, a little plastic thin film. And these cells are dividing, and in the middle of the cell you can see each one of these has got a central dark area which is called the nucleus, where the bulk of all the genetic material of the cell is. And that's where all the code, most of the code is for making copies of new cells. And if you try to stain these cells for a stain that just stains mitochondria, and then you look, and then you look at those cells again after they've been stained, this is what you see. This stain is staining them green, and the nucleus, which is right in the middle of the cell, these dark things here, is this kind of black shadow right in the middle of the cell, and then all around it are these little dot-like structures. Some of them are kind of joined up, some of them are branched, some of them are splitting, and if you look at this in real time, you can see that this is dynamic, that they're joining, they're separating, coming together again. So they're a kind of a network, a dynamic network. We call it a reticulum, which just means a net, really, around the nucleus of the cell. And if these are the old books, they sort of think of one of those little dots and try to look at it in kind of a picture, but of course it's not like that because it's changing every second. But if you take one of those dots and you break it open, you see that inside it is another wall, and in that wall, just like having many kind of interconnecting rooms just like this, there's sort of partial walls separating it called cristae. And right in the middle of all of these rooms, if you like, are little clumps of genetic material. So the mitochondria have their own genetic material, which are important for some information. And when you look at this genetic material, it turns out to be a DNA, a circular DNA molecule, which is not very, very large. It's quite small as DNA molecules go. It's very similar to DNA molecules in bacteria. And this DNA molecule contains the code for quite a lot of the respiratory chain. So going back to the previous slide, that respiratory chain, that energy generating complex, is studied in these walls of the mitochondria. And it's a complex because it's not one thing. There are a number of linked enzyme complexes that are important in producing this energy. So, this of the respiratory chain complexes. So, if you like, in this diagram, this is the wall, the inner wall of that structure. Studied in that are all these complexes of enzymes that somehow or the other produce energy, and it's through ATP. The colored mosaic tiles here are those of this complex whose code is contained within the mitochondrial DNA. But you see a lot of white tiles there. In fact, most of it is white tiles. And all those white tiles, really, those components, those enzymes, or those enzyme subunits, the code is not in the mitochondrial DNA, it's in the nucleus. So this is a kind of a hybrid structure, this respiratory chain. Some of it, the code is contained within the mitochondrion itself, and some of it, the code is not there, it's in the nucleus. So, in order for this chain to work, the code has to make these subunits of these enzymes, and they all have to come together, and they have to fit perfectly together, and then work as a series. That's a very, very complex arrangement. With something like that, you can imagine that there's lots of scope for error. There can be an error in the code, say in the nucleus, there can be an error in the code in the mitochondrial DNA, or there can be an error in the code of some of the machinery that directs all this assembly to happen and to form these multicellular complexes. So I'll just talk very briefly about inheritance generally, very quickly, and then I'll move on to mitochondrial diseases. So remember I spoke about the nucleus. In the nucleus there are, most of the code is contained in chromosomes. In fact, all of it is contained in chromosomes, of which we have 23 pairs. So everybody gets half of their code from, their genetic code from one or other of their parents. So there are pairs. So mostly, for most, there is usually just one gene, which is relevant to disease, for simple diseases of the type that we're talking about, that might be involved in a genetic disease that's associated with the nucleus. But in mitochondria, remember I said that there were many of these DNA molecules, these circular molecules. There are actually thousands of them. And the pattern of inheritance of this circular DNA is quite different from the pattern of inheritance of the pairs of chromosomes that are in the nucleus. So every individual in gets, as I said earlier, half of their nuclear genetic code from one or other parent. But in the case of this mitochondrial DNA, all of this code, this genetic code, comes, with very few exceptions, just from that individual's mother. So do you remember I said that this is a kind of a hybrid mosaic